Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Front Page Fitness. This is episode number 5. As everybody knows, podcasts usually start getting great right around the 5th episode. So we'll see what we have in store for today. My name is Eric Trexler. I am one of your hosts. I'm joined, as always, by the good Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. Lauren, how we doing?
Well, I have it on good authority that people are already trying the Cheese Whiz challenge. So we might expect to be contacted by their attorneys, and we should be prepared for the reckless comments and advice we gave on those earlier episodes.
Yeah, there's a couple issues we have in our first 4 episodes. Our marketing team has begged us, and our legal team have begged us, you got to stop issuing these cheese challenges. And we, just as a matter of integrity and creative direction, we've told them to stop making that request. We're never going to stop. We will always issue these challenges. Another thing that the marketing team specifically has been nagging us about is every time we mention any geographical region, we cause a great deal of turmoil. So Lauren, you made some really reckless comments about Canada in a previous episode. That
wasn't me. No.
We'll see. We can check the tape. I remember it being you. And then someone made some kind of comment about the subway and sewer rats in New York City. Impossible to tell who made those comments, but that also caused a little bit of trouble. So our marketing team has asked us to just never mention any country, state, region, city, town, or municipality. So we'll see how far we can get without mentioning any other of those things. Okay, so we can mutually commit to doing our very best to never mention a place ever again on the show. Does that sound fair?
What about a territory?
They didn't say anything about territories. And I believe you have territories in Canada. Is that correct?
Indeed, there are territories.
Cool. And maybe even provinces. I don't think our marketing team knows Canada exists. I think that's why they left these giant loopholes.
You're doing it again.
Oh, okay. Well, we tried. We made it 10 seconds. Okay, so Lauren, before we get into the segments for today, we have some big news in the cheese world. You sent me, this wasn't a headline, but it was an Instagram video by someone named It's Me Juliet. And I swear I felt like I alluded to this. I might have mentioned it off camera, but when we were talking about Florida man with his cholesterol hands and eating 6 to 9 pounds of cheese per day, I had, I believe, to someone I was speaking to at some time, mentioned the idea of using blocks of cheese as basically the bread of a sandwich. And my inspiration for that was back in the day, KFC, formerly known as Kentucky Fried Chicken, they came out with a sandwich where they basically, instead of bread at the top and bottom, there was just 2 pieces of fried chicken. And then in the middle, there was bacon and cheese and all sorts of stuff. And I was like, why not have a comically large block of cheddar cheese be the buns of your sandwich? And wouldn't you know, Lauren, as you found on the internet, Instagram poster, It's Me Juliet came through. So the video you sent me is basically what looks to be roughly maybe a pound of cheese as the bottom bun, followed by a very generous stack of some cold cut, maybe turkey or some kind of deli chicken slice, some shredded lettuce, some beautiful red tomatoes that look very fresh, mayonnaise, mustard, and then, of course, on the top, yet another seemingly 1 pound block of cheese. So, Lauren, how did you come about this, and did you give it a try?
Actually, one of our excellent listeners sent me the link to this. So thank you to the listener. It wasn't your idea. It was Miss Juliet's, or me, Juliet. I didn't try it, and I don't believe she actually took a bite of it. It looks very, very challenging to eat. So it's possible that Mr. Cholesterol Hands was consuming a burger bun in between these 2 1-pound blocks of cheese. But just from a kind of practical perspective, what's really going to be easy to eat on a regular basis, I think we're going back to the fondue whiz category.
Yeah. Now, I do want to acknowledge this individual, they have to be trolling here. Because as I look at some of the other videos here that come up, one of them is making rat cheeseburgers, where she basically shaped her ground beef into the shape of little rats and is making those. She also has one called high protein nachos, which just looks like ground beef arranged in a triangle as if it was a tortilla chip. So whatever genre this is, I love it. And I fully support this. You are correct. You could only really bite into the sandwich if you had a snake-like jaw that could essentially detach. But honestly, would I try it? Yes. If I could, trim the cheese a little bit on either side, to make it just more physically possible to actually bite into this thing, it actually does look like a pretty nice sandwich. I'm not going to lie. But anyway, I appreciate the listener for keeping us completely up to date and informed with what's happening in cheese-based cuisine. Lauren, are we ready to move on to segment number 1?
Sure.
And by the way, I'm one other off-topic thing before we get into it. I can't wait. We're recording this. I haven't gotten any feedback yet about the geriatric pants, but I am expecting a windfall of interest coming my way, a lot of DMs, and I'm hoping that I can parlay this into some kind of sponsorship for the show. So
actually, there are already YouTube comments requesting a discount code. So get that Amazon storefront up and running and reach out. I think you could be their next influencer.
Yeah, the thing is, tariffs are going to hit these pants hard. These things are going to be marked up to like $700. So we might need to chill for a little bit, and then we can really get this scheme going. But honestly, those pants, as insane as it sounds, they are a lifesaver. So people, go out and get them if you still can. All right, Lauren, we have some business to talk about here. This one hits a little bit close to home, but you sent me a couple headlines. So it looks like this individual's doing some kind of big promotional tour, like a big press push, which is not unusual. That's what people do. If you, for example, publish a book, your publisher is going to line you up on a bunch of different podcasts. And if you've ever seen somebody in a particular space and you're like, whoa, they're everywhere right now, it's not organic. They have a marketing and PR team that is lining up all these things. But basically, that's what's happening with an individual named Dr. William Li. And his book called Eat to Beat Your Diet is apparently a New York Times bestseller. I do not understand what goes into becoming a New York Times bestseller, but this book is apparently one of them. And Lauren, why don't you... So the two little headlines that you've selected, one is Scientist Reveals the 5 Foods to Eat that Burn Fat Better Than Ozempic. And the second headline is These Foods Activate Your Brown Fat to burn your jiggly white fat. So Lauren, what is happening here, and why do we live in a world like this?
I'm not ignoring the subtle shade you just threw at New York by talking about, New York Times bestselling authors and just totally disparaging that title, which is a significant one to authors. And, it happens to be in New York again, huh?
I just said I don't understand how it works, which is true of many things in life. I'm not a person who understands a lot of things.
Well, this guy is basically saying these are these superfoods and they're going to eliminate your visceral fat by potentially turning your white fat into brown fat, and therefore, these are magic weight loss foods. The 5 foods are apples, kale, bok choy, Brussels sprouts, and olive oil. So, I did a little digging, and the claim is that specifically for apples, he's saying the chlorogenic acid in the apple is what is going to promote the that differentiation of fat. And so you're going to get those adipocytes changed into brown fat, right? And there is a paper that shows this in cell culture. So essentially, you're getting those cells in a dish, and you are feeding them with the acid, and then you're seeing, oh, actually, this is going to induce differentiation, and we're actually seeing more transition or activation in from those white adipocytes into the beige or brown adipocytes. So that's where this comes from. There's a kernel of truth, but as I think we probably discussed on our female fitness misinformation podcast, it's very dangerous to take an rodent study and certainly a cell culture model and then try to translate it and use that as a basis for our exercise or nutrition recommendations. There's nothing wrong with these foods. They're high fiber, they're micronutrient dense, and they're nutritious. But are they magic fat loss foods? No. And is the chlorogenic acid in the apples going to somehow magically promote fat loss? Probably not. But I believe you've done some work in the brown fat science area. So what are your thoughts?
Well, first things first, let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. I'm very confused by this claim because I'm pretty sure you could get a lot more chlorogenic acid from coffee than apples.
Also true.
So what is happening here? Everybody loves, like, just from a marketing standpoint, like, what are you doing, guy? Like, you're allowed to just say coffee's the new Well, I guess, okay, here's my reckless speculation is that if you were to come out with a book that said, hey, did you know coffee burns fat better than Ozempic? I don't know, 70% of adults in America would say that's not true because I drink coffee every day.
Mm.
Um, whereas what percent are saying that's not true because I steadfastly and consistently eat 2 apples every single day. It's a little bit easier for you to sell, like, hey, maybe something weird will happen. But anyway, yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind is because I've published research on coffee before, not just caffeine, but coffee itself. And usually when you're doing coffee research, something happens in your paper. You say, well, maybe it was the caffeine. And if it wasn't the caffeine, say, well, what could it have been? The next thing's, I don't know, chlorogenic acid. So that kind of, got me to, that definitely got my attention because I was like, this seems it's severely arbitrary to act like apples are this unique, extremely rich source of chlorogenic acid because that's not really the case. And yeah, if you've had a cup of coffee, then you know what chlorogenic acid does for you, and it's not Ozempic. So that's the first thing. The second thing, Lauren, you kind of teed me up to talk a little bit about brown adipose tissue. Brown adipose tissue is interesting. I got involved with a study when I was in grad school, and a really cool study with like actual scientists, because I was in a program called Human Movement Science, and there are real scientists in that field, but there's different tiers of science, right? So like, just to give you an idea, the person I was working with is an MRI expert who's a professor of physics. And I genuinely believe that if you dropped her in any junkyard in America, she would be able to build you an MRI machine out of whatever she finds in that junkyard. Like just next level brilliant, doing innovative work in the area of MRI. And what we were hoping to do with the kind of broader study is one of the ways that we kind of image brown adipose tissue in humans is we give them an injection of fluorodeoxyglucose, which is this kind of glucose that's got a little label or marker with it. So if a tissue is activated to to a degree that would cause it to uptake glucose, then this labeled glucose would go there. And then when we do a PET CT scan, we can see, what tissues have taken up glucose, and by extension, what tissues have been active here. So basically, all that is to say, it's kind of a cumbersome way to do things, and we were hoping to do a different approach where we had people inhale a xenon-based gas, and then we would do the imaging with an MRI instead of PET CT. And the idea was, you don't need to do these injections. You don't need to have the same dose of radioactivity. It was kind of, wins across the board if we could get it to work. But this kind of measurement stuff, the only reason I bring it up is because a lot of folks might hear about brown adipose tissue and say that doesn't exist in humans. That is a thing that was widely believed by scientists who were fully up to date for many, many decades. But as we got better at measuring it, we actually found out, it looks like adult humans actually do have brown adipose tissue. We used to think that basically babies had it, and then we just don't have it anymore once we reach adulthood. So with better imaging techniques and better approaches to measuring it, we found that, okay, adult humans do have some. It's not a ton. And what's cool about brown adipose tissue is that it is these fat cells that are really rich in mitochondria, and their unique role that makes them distinct from white adipose tissue, which is like our normal fat cells, is that when they're activated, they participate in a lot of what we call uncoupled respiration, or basically thermogenesis. They just kind of churn through a lot of calories and produce a lot of heat. But as they're churning through these calories, they don't actually make all that much chemical energy. It really is like burning wood mostly for heat here. So it's a really fascinating tissue. And unsurprisingly, the way that you activate it is with cold exposure. Basically, when you get cold, your body does two things to try to keep you warm. Number one, you shiver a lot. Most people are well familiar with that. The thing that's happening that you don't recognize is that these little tiny depots of brown adipose tissue, which typically cluster around like the clavicle area and the spine, those are increasing their activity. They're bringing in more substrates like glucose, and they're just increasing their caloric expenditure to produce heat. So that's what brown adipose is doing. Now, here's the downside. There's not much we can really do with brown adipose tissue. We do have it, and it can be activated, but it is not the type of thing that is going to make an absolutely massive impact on your daily energy expenditure. And I can tell you in the study that we did, first of all, people don't like studies where their brown adipose tissue is being activated, because basically what we have to do is make you uncomfortably cold for an extended period of time. And that, as you might infer, is very uncomfortable. So no one likes it. But the bang you get for your buck there is really not worth it in terms of net energy balance. It's not like you can just be a little bit cold and have this massive increase in energy expenditure from activating brown adipose tissue. And so basically what we find is in studies that actually look at energy balance over time, if you introduce cold exposure in a controlled setting, people will have a slight increase in energy expenditure, but they will have a larger increase in energy intake, and they are more likely to gain weight than lose it. And that is kind of the main way that we would say, hey, let's activate brown adipose tissue and see what happens. All this other stuff about how you would activate brown adipose tissue through, eating this food or that food, I have never seen any literature where they said, hey, because this would be the easiest thing in the world to test, and you would have, it would be a very lucrative thing for you as a scientist to show, hey, we gave people a little plate of kale, look at all this brown adipose tissue activity, they're going to lose a ton of weight, and it's going to be beautiful. That research doesn't exist, and it will not exist, because that's just not going to be what happens. So I felt really torn when I was doing research on brown adipose tissue, because on one hand, as a person who enjoys human physiology, I thought it was really fascinating. And it is interesting to see what things, or not what things activate it, but to what extent will energy expenditure go up, for how long. what seems to dictate who has more brown adipose tissue than somebody else, because it is the type of thing that we can kind of adapt. And, our amount of brown adipose tissue is not necessarily static over time. And there's also something called beige adipose tissue, which is basically like white adipose tissue that has started to kind of have its characteristics kind of drift in the direction of brown adipose tissue. So again, I was torn because it's physiologically very fascinating and very cool, but practically speaking, I walked out of that research experience and said, "There's nothing useful that I can do with this," which is really fascinating now, Lauren, because ice baths are obviously all the rage, and cold showers, and every now and then you'll have people say, "Yeah, I do an ice bath because it ramps up my brown adipose tissue and it turns me into a fat burning machine throughout the day, and I'm getting leaner by the day." And one of the things I like about the research I do now at Duke is that, we look at 24-hour energy expenditure with a lab method called doubly labeled water. And it helps you zoom out and say, okay, if we're going to be talking about energy balance over time, let's start actually crunching some numbers. And I can tell you with a high level of certainty, anyone who thinks they're getting lean, first of all, the apples and kale are not turning on your brown adipose tissue to a meaningful degree, but the ice bath will, for sure, for a short period of time. But if you crunch the numbers, it's not doing a thing for you in terms of actually losing fat over time.
And same goes for cryotherapy. I know that was one of their major kind of marketing shticks when cryotherapy started to become a thing. Yeah. And as we've talked about before, you can measure acute energy expenditure during exercise or after exercise for an hour, for a couple hours. But then when we actually look at that versus long-term fat loss, it often doesn't seem to translate.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that is kind of weird that is like in a gray area, this is a thing I don't know anything about, so I'm going to recklessly place it on the table and then walk away from it. But distinct from cryotherapy is something I heard a lot of rumblings about a few years back, and it was called cold sculpting. Have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah, I know.
What's the deal with cold sculpting? Because I feel like if we're talking cold and fat, we have to at least address it. Do you know anything about it?
So it's Cool Sculpting, or Cool Sculpt is the kind of brand around it. And basically, it's applying extreme cold to a small area where you have, quote unquote, stubborn fat, and doing it over, let's say, 6 to 10 1-hour, very expensive sessions, does appear to decrease fat a little bit if you're somebody who only has a small amount of fat to lose. So this is something that you might see at your kind of med spa type place as a treatment option. But there are some cases where you actually get this sort of inexplicable reverse effect, and you end up getting an increase in the number of fat cells instead of the decrease that you're aiming for. And so there are some kind of nightmare stories where people went in for this treatment and they ended up, because you have to get it in a really small targeted area. Like, let's say, your love handles or your lower ab region, those kinds of areas are what people usually do. And if you actually end up in this small group of people, I'm not trying to spread fear around cool sculpting, but you can end up in the situation where you actually have more fat cells at the end of the day, and then it's visibly actually more body fat because for whatever reason it kind of went the other direction.
That's interesting. So the mechanism, the goal is actually to reduce the number of adipocytes, like you are.
No, it's to shrink them.
Oh, it's to shrink them. Okay. But it sounds like in some cases there's some kind of like hyperplasia going on where they're.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Very interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's I think it's it's worth stating our kind of biases and our domains of focus. Lauren, we work in fitness and we work in health, and there are so many tangents you could go into, right? And there are just a couple areas where I have said, I am never going to know much about this stuff. I won't say never, but it's going to take me 20 years to uncover all the rocks or turn over all the rocks in my domains before I start venturing out over there. And so, Lauren, there will be times in the show where if there's anything related to hair, skin, nails, or some of these more cosmetic oriented procedures, I'm not saying you'll know about them, but I certainly won't. And so there will be some times where I'll say, I heard about this thing. I don't know anything about it. Uh, Take it or leave it. And then I will just walk away. So cool sculpting is definitely one of those. But yeah, so getting back to, this whole idea of foods burning fat like Ozempic, was that the claim? I don't want to be, I don't
Burn
want to be
fat
unfair.
better than Ozempic.
Better than Ozempic. So this really strikes close to home because Lauren, I think I told you I recently submitted a letter to the editor at a journal of a food, that's more accurately a bev. I don't even know if you call it a beverage, apple cider vinegar,
We
whatever you would
discussed
call that.
apple cider vinegar. Yes, we did.
Yeah, did we discuss that on the show yet? I don't think.
We did because of
Okay.
our influencer, our fake
Yes.
cancer influence.
Yes. Yeah. So I've got that podcasting issue now where I forget what I've said in front of microphones and what I haven't. But yeah, so I wrote a letter to the editor because like that actually was an instance, Lauren, where there is a randomized controlled trial in humans showing that that thing
Right.
allegedly did burn fat on a level that's similar to Ozempic. And if it ever happens again, I will eat my hat. And that's all I got to say about that. But in general, I get really nervous whenever I see a headline that says blank, blank, blank is nature's Ozempic or burns fat better than Ozempic, because it's worth noting that Ozempic,
Ozempic doesn't actually burn fat.
well, that is that is worth noting. But even if we're just going to say, even if we're just going to say like, okay, these GLP-1 agonist drugs, this whole class of drugs, people are so used to the next scammy thing coming along in anti-obesity interventions or fat loss interventions. It's like, yeah. We heard about this drug and that drug and the other drug. These GLP-1 drugs are different. Like they are fundamentally a different category of discovery and category of application. And I've gone on record and will always go on record saying that these actually translating into the clinical trials and doing what they're doing, this is the biggest thing to me that's happened in obesity research, at least since we discovered leptin in 1994. And honestly, even the discovery of leptin was big for understanding how fat works and how weight regulation works, but we never actually could do much useful with it. Like we couldn't
Yeah.
really do anything with utility in a scalable way. Because frankly, when we first discovered leptin, which is this hormone that fat cells make, and it kind of signals to the brain, hey, the fat cells are full, we're good, no need to keep eating. When we discovered it, we said, oh my God, this is incredible. So people, when they are losing weight and their fat cells are shrinking and they have less less lipid within those cells, we can just give people leptin injections, or even better, if we could develop a pill for leptin, where basically we would just be giving their brain the signal, no need to keep eating, we're full, we're feeling great. That didn't work. And really the main thing people wanted to do, I should be a little more clear with that. The main thing people wanted to do was say, you don't have to diet. We're just going to give you leptin and you're going to lose weight spontaneously. That's the thing that didn't work, because basically we can develop something called leptin resistance, where our cells just stop responding to it. And what you find is people with obesity tend to have extremely high leptin levels anyway. So I should clarify, if you are actually in that instance where you're losing weight and then you are given leptin, it actually will mitigate some of the things that make weight loss a little bit more challenging. But nonetheless, the idea of translating and commercializing leptin as a discovery really fell flat. So these GLP-1 things, like these GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, it shouldn't be understated how big of a game changer there are. And that's why, any of these headlines about nature's Ozempic, I'm always like, here we go again.
Yep, agreed. So
Right.
I made the internet kind of angry the other day because I was on a podcast, Docs Who Lift, the Nadolski Bros, and we were talking about protein and how maybe we're focusing too much on those protein recommendations and not enough on the lifting recommendations. And I said, you know what? Lifting is the cake, and then protein is the icing on the cake. And people got super mad because they said, no, no, you should absolutely be eating as much protein as possible, because if you are resistance training and not getting sufficient protein, you won't gain muscle at all. So I thought this was an interesting one for us to chat about. Can you eat your way to gains? Was I wrong?
There are a great many things in which you are wrong,
Mm.
and many topics in which you speak recklessly and in ways that are inappropriate. But in this instance, I'm going to have to side with you, and I'm honestly really surprised that you got a lot of pushback on that. So are we talking like you got one or two DMs? Are we talking about the comments on the podcast episode were just flooding in? Like what was the scale and scope? Was it two very angry people, or was this like a really widely held belief?
This was a pretty widely held belief, and I'll say there is definitely a sentiment, at least in the older population, peri post menopause, that's really pushing, like how we talked about creatine, really pushing the high protein. And somehow we get so caught up in this conversation around protein and supplements and possibly hormone therapy that these exercise recommendations that we know are the best thing we can possibly do for muscle sort of get left out of the conversation. And so if you're somebody who is newer to fitness and you're entering the space and thinking, what should I do for my health? There's a huge emphasis on these things, and we're not talking enough about lifting weights. And so I think I got some pushback, like I said before, but I'm also seeing it just generally online where people really do think if I'm hitting my protein goal and I'm taking my supplements, then I'm doing a lot for my muscle, and I don't need to really focus on the exercise component.
Yeah. So this is there's a couple ways to kind of get at this question. Can you just eat your way to gains in the absence of lifting? And in some cases, it's good to look at these questions from the extremes, just as kind of like a proof of principle. And this is something that comes up a lot, lately I've been more of a just kind of like exercise for health kind of guy, pretty chill. But back in the day, I competed in powerlifting, competed in bodybuilding, and those are areas where a high level of dietary neuroticism are kind of part of the deal. And a lot of folks in that space, when they're going to, God forbid, go on a vacation, which is going to be one of the most memorable 2 week spans of their life if they're lucky to take a 2 week vacation, some people will generally be distraught and be like, what am I going to do? Because I'm going to be away for 2 weeks and enjoying these extremely rare and incredible experiences, but I won't have access to a gym. And from that common experience of being away from a gym for a week or two, it became really popular for people to say, well, just eat a ton of protein. It'll help you maintain all your muscle in the absence of training. Now, let's be honest. If you're going to go on vacation for a week or two, you're not losing that much muscle anyway. Frankly, it doesn't matter what you do from a dietary perspective. But that kind of idea that eating a bunch of protein in the absence of training will either help you maintain a bunch of muscle or help you build a bunch of muscle. If we want to look at that in the most extreme scenario to just really pressure test the idea, there's a bunch of research on what we call immobilization. So, Lauren, you're obviously very familiar with this kind of work, but basically it's like, hey, you know how you have a perfectly functional ankle? Not anymore. We're going to put it in a boot, and you are not going to be able to move your ankle for a period of time. You'll find, even more extreme cases where they're just going to say, hey, you're on bed rest for the next 2 weeks. There's some pretty extreme interventions out there where people basically just stop moving entirely, either at a single joint or via bed rest. And what we find in those types of studies is when you stop moving a joint or you just stop moving around altogether, there is precipitous loss of fat-free mass and precipitous loss of muscle mass. And eating a bunch of protein does essentially nothing for you. It doesn't matter if you're eating the RDA, zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram. You could double it. Hell, you could probably triple it. And in the case of mobilization, we're not going to see really much at all in terms of attenuating those drops. Now, another way of looking at this is, well, what happens if you overfeed, meaning you eat more than you need to in terms of energy, and you happen to be eating a bunch of protein or very minimal protein? What does that actually look like in terms of the amount of fat-free mass that you gain? And there was a review a handful of years ago, 2017, but it feels like yesterday, by Alex Leaf and Jose Antonio, where this is one of those papers that I love because there's just a big old table where they're like, hey, you want to look at some overfeeding studies? Here's all of them for the most part. And it basically goes through, how long was each study? What were the participant characteristics like at baseline? How much weight did they gain? How many calories did they eat? How much protein? How much fat mass did they gain? And how much fat-free mass did they gain? And generally what you find as you look through multiple dozens of studies where people are overfed in reasonably well-controlled conditions, you find that when you just eat more stuff, you tend to gain weight. That's not, we're not going to stop the presses and print that as a big headline. But what we tend to find is there tends to just be a fraction of how much of that is gained as fat mass versus fat-free mass. And when you look from all these, from study to study, how much of that weight by percentage is gained as fat mass rather than fat-free mass, usually tends to be somewhere in the ballpark of 60-ish to 80-ish% of the weight. Some percentage of that weight gained is going to register as fat-free mass. You could make an argument that the higher you go with protein at the expense of other macronutrients, that percentage goes down a little bit, drops more close to that 60%-ish range, maybe even into the 55-ish% range. But just to give a really clear indication, like most of these studies where people are basically putting this idea to the test, Lauren, which is I'm going to eat a whole bunch of protein and see how much fat-free mass I gain. We're talking about a kilogram of fat-free mass, often less. The most extreme one you can find here that's jumping out to me is gaining about a little shy of 6 kilograms of fat-free mass, but that's in people who basically ate a bunch of food and gained over 16 kilograms of body weight. And so when we look at fat-free mass in that scenario, we have to also remember fat-free mass, depending on the way it's measured, could look like a lot of different things. That's not necessarily I gained 5.8 kilograms of pure muscle tissue, right? It could be certainly increases in water weight. Maybe you've actually added fat cells with that magnitude of fat gain, and there is a portion of the fat cell that actually is non-fat tissue. As odd as that sounds as a sentence, but there are non-fat structures of fat cells. It could even be, sometimes, depending on how you measure it, some of the fat that we store in organs or around organs can register as fat-free mass. And even just adding, frankly, skin tissue, it counts as fat-free mass as well. So all of that is to say, if just force feeding a bunch of protein was causing precipitous muscle gains, you would think that it had been found in any of these multiple dozens of studies. And Lauren, I hate to say that just doesn't seem to be the case. Now, big caveat here. I think that looking at it from a meta level, people in health and fitness and wellness, we really like the idea of linear relationships that exist across the whole span of measurement, right? So the idea being every unit of protein I increase, I'm going to gain more fat-free mass or muscle, and all the way down, it'll be negative. There is some kind of relationship here, but it's just not the linear relationship people make it out to be. So, and what I mean by that is, if you wanted to induce a level of muscle loss or fat or the loss of fat-free mass by intentionally, consistently restricting your protein intake in a fairly aggressive way, you could make that happen. So I'm not saying that protein is fully disconnected from your fat-free mass in the context of a person who doesn't lift weights. But what I am saying is it's not a linear thing, and you are not going to be a person who's eating a fairly balanced, regular diet, not lifting weights, and then you're not going to just bump up your protein and have this really precipitous increase in muscle mass. It's just not how it works. However, at the same time, it is important to recognize if for some reason, I beg you not to do this, if for some reason you decided, I wonder what would happen if I really aggressively restricted my protein for the foreseeable future, you would lose some muscle mass in that process. So I'm sorry, it's not linear. It gets a little complicated. It's kind of messy, but them's the breaks. That's how it works, Lauren.
I think what we need to focus on again is that you're doing challenging strength training, you're doing it over time, you're progressing, you're consistent about it. And the addition of the dietary protein is certainly a good thing. But if we look at the difference between 1.2 kilograms per 1.2 grams per kilogram per day and a 1.5 grams per kilogram per day, this isn't game changing decisions here. And so I see a lot of people stressing about these numbers, should it be 1.2, should it be 1.6, should it be 1.8, should it be higher than that? And I think when it comes to just purely focusing on growing and maintaining muscle, worrying about point something is really not going to be what moves the needle. And if we look at the other things that are really going to promote muscle growth, then let's put all of that thinking into an effort into the training side of things, not into these small details about protein intake. Would you agree with that?
100%. And I have observed in the wild people on the internet arguing over whether or not people should be having 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day or 1.8. Literally arguing over a difference of 0.2. And honestly, if a person tries to drag me into that argument, I will fight you. Not physically, I'm not a fighter, but I will treat you with an extreme level of disdain and contempt because you got to get out of this stuff. Like you said, Lauren, that level of nitpicking over, and frankly, honestly, I'm of the belief that scaling protein recommendations by total body mass makes no sense in general. Like in a theoretical way, I understand the practicality, obviously, but I would argue for a lot of people, it's like you two over here are arguing about 1.6 versus 1.8, but your 1.8 is your 1.6 in terms of the actual, like, if it were scaled the way I think it should be scaled, you guys might actually be eating the same amount of protein on a scaling system that I would use. So,
Not to mention the fact that when you actually think, like, let's say whatever that is ends up being 100 grams of protein, you could easily think you're eating 100 grams of protein and be off by 10 grams no problem, because you
Yeah.
you didn't you didn't measure it, or you measured it raw, or you measured it cooked, or you cut it and then you removed some of the protein because you're removing some fat. I mean, it's what, from a practical perspective, we're not talking about an exact science of I know to the point tenth of a gram how much protein I ate today.
Right. Yeah. It was supposed to be a heaping scoop and you used a flat scoop. I mean, yeah, and that could really matter, like in terms of the actual dose, not in terms of the physiology, as we're, I think, making very clear. But no, I mean, I completely agree with you. Like the general idea is, we've got a pretty straightforward thing happening here. If you want to grow muscle, you have to give your muscles a reason to grow. And when I say reason, obviously you're not going to sit down and logically explain it to them. We need to induce and introduce some kind of stimulus that conveys a very clear signal. Muscle growth ought to happen. Uh, One way to do that is with resistance training. And you can get into all the details about what is the best way to do that in terms of number of sets per week and which exercises are best, and how many repetitions, how close to failure, all that stuff. But when it comes to growing muscle, I feel pretty good about saying, like, if you wanted the bare bones starter pack, uh go do hard things in a gym for an hour, or if 30 to 60 minutes even, and do that 2 or 3 times a week. And that'll get you really far. If all you can do is 30 minutes once a week, that'll still get you a lot further than nothing. Because you tend to find that the effects of a lot of this stuff are, I would argue, over time, pretty logarithmic, in the sense that, you, at a certain point, as you start adding more and more sessions per week and time per session, eventually you're in the land of diminishing returns. But yeah, we need to give muscles a stimulus to grow. Like I said, one way to do that is to do hard stuff that makes your muscles tired, and go close to a fatiguing state when you're doing these exercises. Another way to do that is with exogenous testosterone, and the literature on that is pretty clear. There's been studies where they do a fairly bare bones training program versus steroids with no training program at all. And the steroids actually tend to work better for muscle growth, because they are literally giving a direct chemical signal: you should grow, and muscles are happy to take that instruction. So at the end of the day, the stimulus is what's driving the ship. Uh, but the protein needs to be there in some quantity to actually enable that process, to facilitate the downstream effect, which is that we are going to assemble more proteins than we break down over time, right? And so obviously, having a high protein diet you can basically hedge your bets and say, I want to make sure that for every bit of stimulus I'm introducing, we have more than enough amino acids around, so that the bottleneck here, the rate limiting factor, is going to be how much stimulus was introduced rather than the amount of raw materials around to actually build these proteins. So protein plays a big role, but a lot of people have just such a miscalibrated sense of, it's 50% training, 50% protein. Not at all. It's a dramatically more skewed relationship than that. It is the quality of the stimulus dictates how much growth is being directed, and simply having enough protein around plays a permissive role in allowing that to come to fruition. And like you said, Lauren, we can talk as much as we want in the fitness world about what is the optimal amount of protein, but the good enough amount of protein, frankly, and if you got in trouble, this will get me way more in trouble. The generally good enough amount of protein is pretty much what you find in a standard balanced diet. Like, yeah, if you want to throw a couple scoops of protein in there, great. But like, if we do a little survey of, it's not that unusual to just find a person who gives no thought to what they eat in America, and you find that they're eating 1.2, 1.3 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. Americans eat a lot of protein. It's what we do. And yeah, you're going to get the lion's share of your gains if that is all you're doing, is just gravitating to that, because Americans like to eat a big piece of meat at dinner. We tend to have some meat at lunch. And hey, if you have eggs for breakfast, all of a sudden you're looking at a fairly substantial amount of protein across the day.
Just don't do 30 egg whites because
Yeah,
the mango smoothies and everything, they're,
don't,
can
yeah.
really
If you're going to do
cause
30
some
eggs,
serious relationship problems, as we've discussed.
which we still have no updates about,
No,
which is crazy
I know.
and really suspicious. But anyway, yeah, if you're going to do 30 eggs a day, cook them. I beg you. But yeah, so Lauren, I think that we're in complete agreement here. We're in violent agreement because this is something that we've talked about many times before. I've written articles covering this in the Mass Research Review, obviously, just because it is something that comes up so frequently. And Lauren, I mean, you're in. I'm curious because you did your PhD literally in one of the top protein research labs in the world, which after we got a lot of hate mail, I looked back into it. There are many accredited universities in Canada, and I've updated my personal accreditation system accordingly. McMaster is, in fact, one of them.
There's at least one.
Correct. I've been told there are multiple. But you did your PhD at one of these top protein labs. Did your views about protein change from start to finish over this multiple year kind of process of studying protein? Did you walk away from it saying, like, you know what, after doing all this nuanced work about protein, these are things that I now have more conviction in, or things that I maybe have changed my mind about? Like what did that process do for you as a person who is working on a topic, protein, where there are so many opinions and so much diversity of thought and frankly so many arguments?
Yeah, I think it's an unnecessary thing to argue about, frankly, because even when we look at measurements of protein synthesis, for example, there are measurements that are done over a period of hours, and that's an infusion model. And so you're kind of hooked up to an IV, and you might get a certain set of results with that tightly controlled model. And then you could argue that, well, using these stable isotope tracers is maybe more appropriate to look at because you can take those and go about your day, and it takes into account those quote unquote free living conditions. So the meals that you eat, your sleep, your exercise sessions, all of that is going to be kind of encompassed in it. But then when we actually get down to the analysis itself, there's so many steps that go into this. It is incredibly technical, and ultimately, we're going to see some variation between people, as we do with pretty much every outcome that we measure when it comes to exercise science, nutrition, metabolism. And so I think these really detail-oriented fights about these small amounts of protein and acting like this is going to be the game changer, it's just a kind of a misunderstanding of muscle physiology, of protein synthesis, and of the fact that not all the protein you eat is just going straight to the muscle. The body uses amino acids for many things, and so it's good to have them around, but it's not like you're eating that chicken breast and it's just attaching to the bicep.
Yeah. That's also another kind of funny misconception is when it comes to protein timing, right? So like people will be like, I need to have this really rigid timed schedule throughout the day where I have a chicken breast at 3 p.m. and then I have a piece of fish at 6 p.m. and they time it all out. And it's like, it's a beautiful delusion that humans have that like once we eat a meal, we're like, well, I'm glad that's over. And that's just it. Like the effects of that meal are instant and it's over. And in reality,
as soon as you've swallowed it, it's done.
Yeah. I mean, and prove me wrong, where to go. But we completely disregard the fact that it's like, well, that's the start of the journey. And now we're going to do the old magic school bus field trip where they shrink it down and go through the GI tract. A lot of extra steps going on here. And how long will that take? kind of depends.
Mm,
Chicken breast and what was the meal?
right.
If you had a bunch of olive oil and broccoli, you got a bunch of fiber and fat slowing down that digestion. We're very meaningfully changing the time scale of that digestion, absorption, appearance in the blood, etc. And I the phrase that Eric Helms uses that I think is a great way to phrase it. He always talks about the conga line of all these meals just kind of lining up in your GI tract across the day. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a tendency in fitness to take these oversimplified views of protein feeding and say, okay, I need to spike my blood levels of these key amino acids at 3 p.m. So at 3 p.m. I'll eat a chicken breast. And it's like, you're already off by a lot. But yeah, these hyper specific recommendations of timing and dose and things like that are certainly, on one hand, they lead to arguments that are quite silly when you zoom out and say this is whatever you think you're arguing is not what you're actually arguing here. But having said that, Lauren, I think it's always good to leave with some degree of practical guidance, some practical application. So I am curious from your perspective. We've kind of put ourselves in an interesting spot here because we have talked down a lot of the overhyped perspectives of protein is going to have these massive effects on its own without training. We've kind of we've undercut the hype of saying a super high protein diet is going to be dramatically better if you are lifting compared to a more moderate protein diet. But at the end of the day, we do live in a world where sarcopenia is highly prevalent in older individuals. We live in a world where people have to make choices about the foods they're eating on a daily basis. So what do you tell people who are interested in supporting their health? Maybe they don't want to be a pro bodybuilder necessarily, but what do you tell people about how they should be making their day-to-day, meal-to-meal protein decisions and what kind of targets might they be reaching for?
I like to set a minimum, if we're going to do that, at around 1.2 grams per kilogram. I think that's a good place to start. There's good enough evidence to suggest that that is better than the RDA. And so it's worth kind of making that jump up. But going above and beyond that, if that's something that you want to do, go for it. It's certainly not going to be harmful. Some people feel that they get more satiety from an even higher protein diet than that, and then that's perfectly fine. But there's another group of people that feel really overwhelmed with these higher protein recommendations, such that they're never really able to hit them, and they're not enjoying their diet anymore. And so I think it's really important to make the distinction between what's necessary and then above and beyond. Sure, if you like, then that's fine, but no pressure to kind of cram in that additional protein if you don't want to and if it's not going to be sustainable for you. And as always, let's focus on doing challenging resistance training. It's good for your muscles, it's good for your bone, it's good for your longevity as a physically functioning human, and
Good for your brain.
good for so I think let's start there and let's get more people lifting. Let's aim for something around the 1.2 as a minimum. And those are kind of key, simple, effective take homes that will make a difference. But the lifting has to be there. Do you think my recommendation is too low?
First, a big question. Now that you're Canadian, do you actually think in kilograms with human weights?
I can sort of speak both languages. Canada's weird because so if you were to go to the deli, for example, then you would order meat in grams, but then if kilograms, grams, and then but if the outside temperature is going to be Celsius, but the indoor temperature is going to be Fahrenheit.
That's wild.
I know we said that we wouldn't say anything disparaging about Canada, but I don't understand that. I'm sorry.
How do you do cooking temperatures?
those are Fahrenheit.
All right. Well, there you go.
But
That
then
that
driving is kilometers per hour.
because my wife and I watch the Great British Bake Off, and they always talk about their cooking times and temperatures, and I'm always like, you're never gonna finish. But all right, so um, for people who enjoy using pounds as a unit of human body weight, so for your 1.2 recommendation basically is if someone's about 150 pounds, which is always like in textbooks, the kind of generic human is like 70 kilograms, about 150 pounds. That would be about 80 grams of protein a day, right? So if at every meal you were intentional, let's say you're having 3 meals a day, at every meal you're intentional about getting 20 grams of protein from like a primary protein source. There's a good chance that, that is obviously only going to be 60 a day, but you're probably going to get the other 20 from just your residual proteins coming in from carbohydrate and fat sources. So in terms of you sitting down and thinking, where's my protein coming from? You could very feasibly achieve that by just saying at every meal, make sure whatever your protein source is going to give you a good 20-ish, 25 grams of protein on its own. And the rest of the stuff will pretty much fall into place. I don't think that's too low for someone who's into kind of a general health. I want to make sure I'm not completely wasting my time in terms of, doing this resistance training. I want to give my body what it needs to really utilize that stimulus. 1.2, I think, is a totally sensible recommendation. But I do think it's worth just acknowledging from a practical side, if you like eating protein, there's certainly no major drawback of going comfortably beyond that. And I think it's also important to recognize there's some folks that just really like eating a high protein diet. Maybe it helps them manage their appetite better. Maybe they just really enjoy protein foods and they're like, oh, great, more for me. That's awesome. And, frankly, usually dietitians will get a little bit, they'll start to get a little bit uncomfortable with you saying anything above 1.6 grams per kilogram. And that is 2 times the RDA. And for whatever reason, I'm sure dietitians will fill me in via DMs. That is the number where a lot of people start to get really uncomfortable with some of the fitness industry recommendations that get really high. So I feel like if I'm in a room of all, more clinically oriented dietitians and I'm talking about protein, I'm like, 1.2, 1.4, maybe 1.6 if you want to go crazy. And that's where I cut it. But we certainly do have evidence from a lot of different sources, very ample evidence to suggest that if you do not have an underlying medical condition that specifically makes high protein diets a contraindication, going even above 1.6 is fine. You cannot you really can't point me to the study where you say, because this individual ate 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, that's why we saw the following pathological outcome that was clinically relevant. There's a zillion studies where people eat that much protein and none where we really see those outcomes. So all that is to say, whatever helps you from a protein intake perspective, feel like you're, supporting your goals in terms of muscle growth or muscle maintenance, whatever matches your kind of taste preferences, whatever is feasible for you. There's a lot of wiggle room within that range of 1.2 to set the cap
Higher.
where you like, and there's even been, if I look back at that paper I mentioned previously of those overfeeding studies, obviously Jose Antonio was one of the 2 authors of this review. And so they did some of the studies where the highest number in the table is 4.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. So again, that same 70 kilogram individual, they would be eating, instead of, I think I said like 80 grams of
80.
protein, they would be eating 308, which is quite a step up. Now, I'm not going to say I've never seen it because I've been in the fitness game a long time. I'm not going to say I've never seen it, but that is certainly a unique way to do protein. But even within that study, they did not identify really any clinically relevant outcomes where they would say, oh, that's a problem. So all that is to say, you have a tremendous amount of wiggle room, but huge caveat so the dietitians don't rage quit and give us a 1-star review. If you have reason to believe, or you just have uncertainty about whether or not you may have a medical condition that might alter your protein needs or your ability, your body's ability to metabolize protein, or, if you believe that there is any chance that you might have some kind of clinical condition that would alter your protein recommendation, obviously the best case scenario is that you consult with a qualified healthcare professional, perhaps a physician who may refer you to a dietitian, work with your medical team as they see fit. So in that instance, of course, you want to make sure that you are checking all the boxes and setting yourself up for a nice, long, healthy life. But those instances, I have to say, based on the literature, are few and far between. It's not like, a third of the population out there is like, has some severe health issue limiting or dictating how much protein they ought to be consuming. It is a fairly low prevalence type thing, if I may go out on a limb, Lauren. All right, Lauren, anything else to say about protein before we wrap up here?
Just that I'd like to issue our weekly challenge, and that would be how many apples can you eat per day, and how much body fat can you lose?
So I'm going to be honest, apples upset my tummy. So I'm going to opt out of this challenge. But here's what I will do instead.
You can do the insane cheese sandwich.
Here's what I'll do instead. Well, I'm a vegetarian, so that big stack of deli meat is going to be a challenge.
Replace it with more cheese. It's fine.
I'll do the little shredded cheese. Yeah. So here's what I can do. When someone sets the PR for how many apples they had, which I expect will be astronomical, I will drink the equivalent of chlorogenic acid in coffee, which is going to end up being like 3 ounces. and then we'll see.
Who loses more fat?
Was the Ozempic effects we both experienced, was it truly the chlorogenic acid, or did the apple eaters fare much better than I did? Only time will tell. But I've been pushing this hypothesis that the chlorogenic acid in coffee is going to be like Ozempic, because I have basically been living off of coffee almost exclusively in a way that's not good for my health in any way possible. So I'm waiting for those effects to kick in anytime here. And it should be just a matter of did the good doctor mention if there was some kind of waiting period that I should be expecting?
I don't think so. I think it was just, you
got to read the book. I'm sure it's
that's right. I will order the book, and I'll give the listeners my full review on the next episode.
All right, yeah, that would be something. You'd really demonstrate your love for the craft. You have to give you that. All right, folks. As always, we really appreciate you joining us for Front Page Fitness. If you like the show and you want to support it, make sure that you like, rate, subscribe, review, all that stuff. If you're going to leave a review and you don't know what to leave, generally 5 stars would be a humble recommendation. If you want to send hate mail or letters to the editor, or you want to just let us know about some interesting thing that's happening in health and fitness, maybe a headline that you'd like us to address or a topic you'd like us to address on the show, you can send us an email at frontpagefitnesspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. Take care, and we will see you next week.